This is the Nielsen Norman Group UX podcast. I'm Therese Fessenden. Designing digital products can feel overwhelming, especially when requirements keep shifting and features often seem to kind of pile up one after another without a clear structure. And while it's not always intentional, many UX designers end up focusing on fixing screens, small changes, rather than solving the underlying design problems and building a solid understanding of the problem spaces that they're working on. But what if I told you there's actually a way to wrangle some of that complexity and make sense of it all? Today, I'm sharing a chat that I had with Sophia Prater, the creator and mastermind behind the Object-Oriented UX framework, or OOUX. It's a framework that helps designers align digital systems with how people naturally think and how developers naturally design. We talked about a lot of things, but mainly why so many UX teams seem to struggle with complexity and how object-oriented UX as a framework can provide a more intuitive way to organize information and improve collaboration across teams. Sophia has spent the last decade refining this approach and sharing her insights along the way. And I think her perspective just might change the way you approach product design. If you're up for it, let's get into it. Here's Sophia. Sophia, welcome. Welcome to our show. I'm so stoked to have you here to talk about object-oriented UX because this is actually a relatively new concept to me. I say new-ish. Going through college and learning programming, I learned about object-oriented programming, and I kind of understood the concept of that, but to hear it used in the context of UX is really interesting and cool. And so I'm happy to have you here to elaborate a bit more on it. And so credit to, Anna Cayley, who put out our content on object-oriented UX and recognizing the value that it has. But before we get into its value, I would kind of like to backtrack a bit because this is sort of the product of your work in UX, and it's sort of a culmination of all the things you've learned. So I'd love to know a little bit, how did you get into UX design and kind of what brought you to the object-oriented UX framework? So I guess let's start with the first question there.
Yeah. It was an accident. Probably you hear a lot of guests say, just like circumstances and the stars aligned. But I graduated from Georgia Tech with an industrial design degree. So I was looking to design refrigerators and teapots and chairs and stuff. That's where I was looking for jobs in 2008. And then just through a series of events, like friend of a friend, random party that I was at, I met a recruiter for Accenture. And Accenture was hiring UE analysts because it was UE back then. So this was a user experience analyst. And she emailed me the job description. I was like, yes, this, because actually the work that I've been doing in industrial design, I'd always sort of gravitated to the user interface side. So I worked, I had a 6-month internship with Electrolux. And at that internship, I did not care about the radius on the refrigerator hinge. I was like, how are people going to fit their pizza boxes into this refrigerator drawer? Where the eggs are going to go. And the eggs are going to be if they're on the door, are people going to be nervous about that because eggs could break? I was thinking about how somebody would interact with the refrigerator and also really how things were organized. So the information architecture of the refrigerator was where I was interested. So I got really, really lucky. I got the job. I got 2 weeks of core analyst school that everybody from Accenture goes through, or that did back in the day. This was 2009. And then I got 4 days of UX training, and then they put me on a project. So, and they put me on a very complex project. It was B2B insurance. So I was designing screens for for insurance professionals to design insurance packages for large corporations. So incredibly complicated. All sorts of intricate business rules, all sorts of nuance, definitely building it on legacy software. So all sorts of technical constraints. So I was so excited about user experience design. I was like, this sounds so much fun. And then I got into the reality of it. And the first 5 years in UX was really, really tough. It was a lot of complexity, just a fire hose, like everywhere I went. It was Accenture. And then I went and I worked for another consulting company that was all government. So then I had clients like the IRS and the VA, more like internal business systems. So I was, in the beginning, I had a lot of complexity thrown at me. And not only was I not given the time to understand the problem domain, like really understand what I was designing for, it was actually not really even expected of me to design, to like know what was actually happening. It was like, just UX it, just like put your UX fairy dust on top of it. So I was just feeling like really set up to fail. I was going through projects, and then like later in the projects, a common theme was like having this feeling of just wanting to pull my hair out because like why did nobody tell me this? Like scope changes later in the process or later in the project, or requirements that like came out of nowhere, like this one little business requirement that just like would blow up all these high fidelity screens that I designed, and like just thinking like, why did nobody tell me this? And then I would have the little internal guilt trip of like, well, maybe there was a question that I should have asked, but thinking like, how would have I known to ask this? And then the products that I was actually launching, I didn't feel like amazing about them. I was like, I know this is a little bit better, like incrementally better, but is it like deeply systemically better? And that's what I wanted. I wanted that deep work. I wanted to feel like I was not just moving the deck chairs around of a sinking ship. And so it was really, really frustrating in the beginning. And that's kind of what led me to slowly over the years developing OOUX, because that's object-oriented UX, because I just like, I didn't want to be miserable. It was just really, really frustrating. And again, there were those glimmers of hope, like, oh, like how do I bottle this up? Like I want more of this. And that changed when I got to CNN and started like really thinking about systems instead of pages.
Yeah. So let's talk a bit about that, because I do think, and it's funny you mentioned the complexity aspect, and I feel like complexity, especially in our line of work, it can be invigorating to work with. It can also be like bang your head against the wall or pull your hair out, as you said, right? Which is just like, you see this complexity, you witness it, and almost feel a bit powerless in an effort to wrangle it or work within that sort of environment. And so I know for me, complexity felt that way at first. And then over time, I started to learn to like complexity. And certainly certain aspects of complexity I still get drawn to. I'm like, ooh, this is like a really weird problem. I like to unpack this. And almost like you were saying too, like who cares about the radius of was it the handle of the refrigerator when I can be thinking about, can the pizza boxes fit? Like that's a complex question. And then you think about, well, where can these fridges fit? And like, can they fit into a typical house? And what happens when you make it large enough for a pizza box? Should we redesign pizza boxes? Okay, not in scope. Get back on track, right? And so there are these like moments you have where, you can kind of see something that maybe on the surface, it seems like a simple answer. And then as you start peeling the onion back on these different design challenges or problems, you reveal that complexity further, right? So you mentioned that complexity sort of inspired you, right? Well, a combination of complexity and not wanting to be miserable, right?
Yeah.
How did object-oriented UX kind of enter the stage, so to speak? And what was the aha moment? I know you mentioned CNN briefly. Was it that, or was there another sort of moment that was like, okay, I think I have a handle on what can help here?
Yeah. I love that you mentioned how invigorating complexity can be, because when I was in those situations of so much complexity, never once was I like, I want a less complex problem. That was never even crossing my mind. It was just, I want better tools to be able to solve for this complexity in a much more graceful and elegant and collaborative way. And then to be able to solve even more complex problems, right? And so that is what I was seeking. And I was just jumping around to different organizations. And I finally landed at CNN, which had all those problems as well. All of those problems. I was at CNN.com. And in June of 2012, I was pulled onto the election results project. So this was Obama's second election. And what I was tasked with was, okay, we've got the 2008 screens. Basically, we're just going to use the 2008 screens, but we're doing this new thing called responsive design, where like we can have like multiple different screen sizes because now the iPad had come out. So they were like, okay, like I know you're getting pulled on late. Like the first development sprint starts on Monday. This was like a Thursday. They're like, but don't worry about it. Like, just look at the 2008 screens. We just need them sort of rejiggered for a mobile desktop and tablet. And all we need is the state detail page for Monday, because we're just going to do the state detail page. So like California, Georgia, New York, right? So like that would be like the landing page that you would go to for a specific state where you would see all the results for that state. And they're like, we're just going to start with that one page. So just design that one page in mobile, tablet, and desktop. And like this was the aha moment. Like I can pinpoint it. In that moment, I was like, there's something wrong with this picture. Like you are asking me to design a cog in a machine that I do not understand. And I instinctually knew, I was like, with responsive design, I need to create a system that has the fewest number of moving parts, because every part needs to move, right? Every part now needs to be designed. Basically, it was basically it was more adaptive than responsive, but every part needed to be designed 3 times. So we were having it was like this exponential complexity that was happening for any kind of unnecessary or extraneous complexity that was in the design would get multiplied by 3 from a design perspective, but also from a development perspective. And that to me, I was like, nope, that is not going to work. Like that is not going to work for me as a designer. And I think this is a really high risk for the developers too. And it turned out also, when you reduce the number of moving parts, then it's much better for your users as well. When you reduce complexity, extraneous complexity, you need to kind of honor the inherent complexity in any system. So instead of doing what I was told, which I always kind of encourage people to give people what they need, not necessarily what they ask for. And I felt safe enough in this particular situation to do that. So I spent the weekend basically also like learning about election results. Like I was in my 20s and like didn't really know how our government worked. I barely knew the difference between the House and the Senate. So I needed to do some domain research and really figure out like, what is the truth of how this works? Because the information architecture, like I've said this before, like the bones of our information architecture, we don't really design. Like they just need to reflect the truth of a system. We need to discover what is true about a system, what is true about a domain. And then our information architecture should be as much as possible a direct reflection of that. And somehow over that weekend, I landed on this idea of like, I need to figure out what the main concepts are within this system, which was basically states, different races, like the government, the governor race, the Senate race, a presidential race, and results. So the actual results, and candidates were there too. So it was like, there's like these main concepts that are and they are all connected and they all kind of flow with each other. So on that Monday, I came in, I did not have a detail page for the state landing page. I had a 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. It all fit on one piece of paper of this system and how these concepts could repeat and were connected. And I basically reduced it from what was like 9 or 10 different templates with variations to like 4 templates with variations. So it made a much simpler design. It was so much better for the developers. And I got this like realization that, okay, this was like, responsive design sort of forced me to do this, but like I could have been doing this all along. Like this is not necessarily just for responsive design. This is just like for anything that we're designing. We want to basically reduce the number of moving parts and make sure that those concepts are really clear. So, long story shorter, I ended up getting a speaking. It was a success. It worked. It was wonderful. We pulled it off. It was a great experience. We hit all of our numbers and then some. And I was like, this felt really good. This felt right. And I managed to get on the speaking stage to do a case study about it. That talk was called The Simplicity Imperative at Adaptive Paths UX Week. And that talk went over really, really well. And I came back and did a workshop based on that talk the next year. And then, so I basically had to figure out how to teach what I was doing. And that was how OOUX really was formed, as I taught it during that workshop. And I got a really great response. And I was like, okay, I'm in this. Like, I got to keep teaching this and using it. You know, teach what you need to learn is one of my mantras. So figuring out how to explain it to somebody actually helped the process get better. And I kind of have been cycling through that for the last 10, 11 years now of teaching the process to solidify it, then testing it out in the wild to solidify it even more, and then going back to teaching it. So that's where it all came from. And it's just been, the rest is history. I've just been working on making OOUX better and stronger and more effective for taking in a lot of complexity.
Yeah. I appreciate that, sharing that story for one, because I think it helps to illustrate something, for example, as complex as different election races and relationships, and how fundamentally, and I love what you said about, we don't really design the information architecture. We're reflecting a system and its parts and how they relate to each other. And I think that speaks to the common challenge that I know when I was a younger designer, the challenge I had with my ego getting in the way of design, where it's like, oh, I have to reinvent this, or I need to create something even better. Like, I'm laughing because my, I don't want to say thesis, but my senior year project, we had to pick a design studio challenge. And I said, I'm going to redesign the calendar. A calendar, right?
It does need it, actually. So
there are some challenges with, the Gregorian system, but no. But really what motivated the project for me was, there's this pain point that a lot of people have with managing time. And it would be great to, look at how current calendars approach that. But I think I went about it all wrong as a junior researcher, because my researcher/designer, my original thought was, if I can create a new structure for people to plan their days, which still use like dates and all, then maybe people would be better at managing their time. But I think a framework like object-oriented UX, that would have been much more beneficial when going through a project like of that complexity. Like, how do people manage time? What are the barriers to managing time? And it's not always, there are these weird designs on, digital calendars. But I think if we had maybe approached it from a different angle, instead of thinking of relationships and of, what do we fundamentally need to understand? Events and planning, and how do those interplay, and what are the ways people forecast, future events? And with that in mind, breaking that down, like, what events is sort of a big category. Like, what kind of events are there? Is there independent events? There's meetings, there's and then from there you can establish those relationships a little bit better. And so I think having something like object-oriented UX would be, much more helpful, especially when you are tackling some of these weird, big problems. But can you share a bit? What is an object? And like, how do you define an object from, say, an attribute or a feature? Let's take the calendar, for example. Yeah. I mentioned
what is an object?
Yeah, what's an object for a calendar?
Okay. So an object, I'm so glad you asked. So the objects are the things that people are actually coming for. Okay? And they have what I call SIP, structure, instances, and purpose. So they have their own attributes, okay? They have a structure to them. There's multiple of them. They have instances. Okay. So you can think of multiple examples of them, and they actually have a purpose that is not just a means to an end. Okay. So I say so often, people are not coming for your calendar picker. They're coming for the events. Okay. Your UI components is your packaging. Okay. It's your packaging. It's your handles, but it's not the stuff inside. Okay. what is the stuff inside? What is the actual stuff, the actual concepts that people actually care about? Okay. And usually there's a corollary in the real world, not always, but usually there is some sort of corollary in the real world. You can usually draw a picture of it. Okay. So something like date and time. Why is date and time not an object? Okay. There's lots of dates and times. There's instances, there's a purpose for the date and time. Does it have structure? I mean, you could say, oh yeah, it's like a day, month, year, time even. There's structure to it. Does date and time have a purpose until it is attached to a thing?
No, right? That's an attribute then in that case,
it's an attribute. Right? Nobody is coming for all the dates and times. You're coming for the dates and times on a thing, right? Only like price. People are like, why is price not not an object? It depends on what price is attached to. Is the price attached to an order or a product? Right? Like it is meaningless until you add it to a thing. Description. Description is not an object. What are you describing? What are you describing? So is it for something else? So that would be the difference between an attribute and an actual object. Okay. Object is what people actually care about. And then we get to like, well, is the nav bar an object? And that, again, those are means to an end. Nobody is coming for the nav bar. Nobody's even coming for the search bar. They're coming for the stuff that they are searching for, right? So what are they searching for? What are they actually trying to get to? And we can start with that, and then we can build out from that. So what we end up having is we have a bunch of, Dan Maul's been on my podcast. We've talked about this. I've worked with Brad Frost before. They're on board with this. So these are two different things, your design system, and some people call OOUX your UX system, okay? But your design system, how Dan Maul puts it, he says so many design systems are like a big box of IKEA parts with no instructions. And so like, yeah, we want to be able to reuse them, but we want to know like, okay, these are the parts we have for a chair. This is the parts we have for the wardrobe. So we really want to kind of do inside out design here. It's like, are we selling motor oil? Are we selling ketchup? Are we selling, oranges? That as an industrial designer, I don't design the packaging before I know what is being packaged, right? Like that would be crazy in the industrial design world. Yet we do it all the time in UX, is we design the packaging without thinking about what the actual stuff is. And sometimes we make screens all packaging, and we're not really considering what is the stuff. So the stuff gets really blurry, and that is confusing for people because then they come and they see a bunch of stuff, but we end up with what we call in OOUX, our four unintuitives. We end up with masked objects where we have two different things wearing the exact same outfit. So they look exactly the same, but they're two different things because we just have a card in the design system and anything can go in the card. Mm-hmm. And so you've actually, you're trying to create a simple system of like, here's our card design. And it's just so versatile. Everything can go in it. But then what you end up with is you end up with like an event and a person, and maybe on our calendar system, there's a habit too, like a repeatable habit. And then a person, an event, and a habit all look exactly the same. That's not great. Yeah. And then on the flip side, we get shapeshifters where we have the event, but the event looks different in three different places. So we end up with all these design system issues if we're not thinking about the stuff that's actually being packaged by the design system.
Yeah. I love that metaphor of like the IKEA parts, but like no instructions, and no, it's not just down to guidance either, but it's also about the understanding of what you're building, right? And fundamentally, if you just have these parts and just sort of haphazardly say, well, we're going to make something that does this, I guess, then like we're not really thinking through the value that people get out of each of these objects. So yeah, I think that's a really helpful way of thinking about it. And obviously not everyone's like, oh, I'm going to try to redesign the calendar, right? You may be doing something a bit smaller scoped. So I guess I want to, pick your brain a bit about that too, right? Because like maybe a digital product starts out as relatively simple, but over time, becomes more complex. And so how does object-oriented UX assist designers and product teams in this management of that kind of snowballing complexity?
Right. Can I curse on this podcast? I won't drop an F-bomb, but we will say, let's just call this the enshittification of the internet of like, or the kludge factor of like, and I'm gonna nod to Emmett Conley at Intercom, and I did an OOUX workshop for them, and they've got like some OOUXy vibes going over at Intercom. But what he was talking about, what I so much agree with, is this idea of if you are tacking on feature by feature by feature, we are in so many organizations, we are feature factories. Woo, we're agile and we're doing these tiny little chunks of features and we're just tacking them on and tacking them on, or we have a merger. Okay. And then we got to like figure out how to like these two things come together, or this new, technology comes out. So let's make another feature to leverage this new technology. And what we do is we don't have a strong foundation of that environment, of that digital environment. So we want our digital environments to have good bones, just like a house. You want a house to have good bones. And then you can go and say like, okay, like we can add a porch over here, or we can like, upgrade this bathroom or turn the basement into, a whole guest suite or something like that. But you want that house to have good bones. So if you can figure out that good bones of information architecture, then growing and creating a more and more robust system does not necessarily mean that that system is going to become kludgy, right? I do believe that we can create nice foundational systems that are strong enough to support additional robustness added on top of them. And the way that I see prioritization and the way that I see kind of road mapping from an OOUX perspective. So I don't even know if we've mentioned ORCA yet, but the actual process that I teach and that we go through, like object-oriented UX is much more of a philosophy. That's philosophy that there's actually good evidence that people think in objects, and that if we can make sure that we understand the objects, so object-oriented, we understand the objects in a system so that then we can design systems that the users understand the objects in the system, that it's going to be a more intuitive system. And also, hey, developers tend to think in objects too, so it's going to help us interface with developers as well. So there's all these nice benefits to that philosophy. ORCA is the actual process, and that stands for objects, relationships, calls to action, and attributes. So what you can do if you started from an OOUX perspective and you were really clear on here's what our objects are, here's the concepts that like people really care about, that people are actually coming for, here's how they're all connected, the relationships, here are the calls to action, the actions, the functionality that users can take on those objects, and here's the attributes of the objects, okay? So here's the structure of those objects. If you've kind of done that, then what you can do is you can parse it down. So I like to design a system with like kind of forecasting into the future. Like ideally, this is what we're looking for, because it doesn't take that long. I'm talking like weeks, not months, to be like, here is the ORCA that we're seeing like even like 3 to 5 years in the future. Then what you can do is you can pare that down and you can say, okay, let's prioritize our objects, prioritize the relationships between those objects. And then you get this cascading. Like if you eliminate or phase out some objects, then that eliminates the relationships, the calls to action on them, and then the attributes, of course. But then with even the remaining objects, you can say, okay, here's the relationships that we can make work now based on like how the databases work and the APIs and everything. Here's the calls to action, the functionality that we can make work, and it's the most important right now for our users. And here's the attributes that are most important. So this creates this really nice foundation. And then instead of thinking about rolling in features, you're rolling in a new object. Or often what we do, we talk about upgrading objects from metadata, upgrading a piece of metadata to an object. So category was metadata, and now we're going to turn it into an object. It has its own attributes, okay? So we can sort of keep the mental model really strong. It's just our objects become more powerful. Maybe they get some more attributes so we can like sort and filter them in new ways. They get new relationships. Maybe even a new object gets introduced, but I have all these like nice foundational objects. It's not going to break my mental model to introduce a new object, okay? And then I maybe introduce all of a sudden I can take a new action on this object. Right? I could merge these two when before I couldn't merge. And then I can add additional attributes. So you can think about it in those 4 ways of actually just like making your ORCA more robust, but it comes down to this like really strong foundation instead of just like kludging on a bunch of features, and then nobody really understands, your users definitely don't understand the mental model / OOUX. They don't understand the object relationship, CTAs, and attributes, and nobody in the company really does either. And you end up with lots of kludge. So we were mentioning Meta, so like Instagram. So I'm back on Instagram. I'm going to figure out how to make reels. I've been making reels. It's been a lot of fun, actually, unless it's not fun, because the storytelling aspect of it is really fun. But when it comes to actually using it, it's a mess. So like, for example, if I want to edit a reel on Instagram, so it's one of my reels, there are 3 different menus on a reel. So there's the menu, like a long press in my grid gives me a menu with XYZ options to take action. Then if I'm in a feed and I go to the kebab, which is at the bottom, I think, in the feed, I get a different set of actions. And then if I'm in full screen, if I'm in sort of the full screen view, I get my kebab moves, but I get a different set of actions. This should be the same set of actions everywhere. There is no reason to have 3 different menus. And the reason why, like what happened for me, is I posted a reel. I realized I had a typo in the caption. So I go and look for edit. Edit is only in one of these 3 places. But I just find the CTA menu. It's a long CTA menu. I don't see edit there. I figure I can't edit. So I go and I delete the reel and recreate it. Later on, 2 days later, I'm in another view. I see that menu again, and there's edit. And I feel completely gaslit. I'm like, I swear edit was not here when I was looking at this before. Why is it? And I just literally deleted and recreated a reel because I didn't think edit existed. Edit exists in another place. And I now have to memorize where edit is. So
you have to memorize 3 menus and not only that, the contents of each menu. Yep.
Yeah. And this is one reason we're not thinking, I can guarantee at Instagram, even though I have done a workshop at Facebook, I can guarantee at Instagram, they're probably, just by looking at the system, they're not thinking in objects. They're thinking in features, they're thinking in screens. They probably have the feed designers and the profile page designers, and those designers are probably not talking to each other and not thinking. And so they doubled the work. They created the menu twice. It created extra work, actually, and extra cognitive load. On the users.
Yeah. And I think that you're kind of hitting the core of it, right? Which is that not having object-oriented thinking as a philosophy, right, leads to this confusion as far as how to design for them. Not just mismatch expectations, but maybe even assumptions that things don't exist when they do, right? And if we think in terms of objects, right? I mean, we literally as human beings have object permanence, like as a skill that we develop as babies, because we learn an object exists, it goes somewhere else, it comes back out, and it still exists, and it does, it hasn't disappeared, like it's just not in sight, right? And so this concept that we as human beings have mental models, I mean, even the term mental model, right? It's a noun, it's thinking about something existing in a particular shape or form, right? Having that understanding allows us to keep track of objects where they are, where they exist. I feel like that also makes it a bit compatible too with like design systems, right? And the fact we have components and how do these components fit together. So actually with that in mind, there's this saying UX is dead, and I want to pick your brain. Do you think that is true? I know the state of UX can feel quite dire. What's your take on this? If you had to like quickly take a stab at it.
Okay. So, I mean, I've experienced bad UX like 17 times today. So the idea that UX is dead, I think is absolutely crazy. But I think what has happened, and it all actually makes sense, what has happened. I think what has happened is this, is we come into UX wanting to solve big problems. And companies hire us as UX designers. But then, like I was talking about, actually this loops back around to what I was talking about at the top of our conversation of not only are we not given the time to actually understand the problem domain, we're not expected to. So we're just expected to UX it. So then our hands are tied. And then what happens is we end up doing not great UX, or it's completely set up to fail. And then they say, you know what? You're really just doing glorified UI design. And now your job is on the line. And this is incredibly frustrating, incredibly unfair. But I think what it is and I can't believe I'm saying this because it's like, I feel like we should be beyond selling what UX is, right? Like this is like, I was dealing with this in 2009, like selling my value as a UX designer. But I think UX does need I don't know, like a PR campaign or something. I don't know. Like this is what we actually do. But here's the thing is if we want to solve complex problems, we need really good tools. So, and I think that those tools are not usually taught. We don't have those tools. And so what happens is when we do say, okay, like you're given a little bit more time to solve the problem, and maybe we don't make the most optimized use of that time. So if we're given an inch, or if we can take an inch, we need to make the best of that inch that we're given to show industry, to show our organizations, hey, here's the kind of problems that I can solve, okay? And get them to be like, wow, that is amazing. I am so glad you asked that question. You just figured out this big high-risk assumption that we've been operating on. So OOUX is a tool for that, to be able to figure out like what are the landmines that are in our future. Let me go ahead and diffuse some of those landmines. And if we can be the people that are asking those really tough questions that are identifying and diffusing the landmines in the future, right? If we're the ones that can take a ton of complexity and channel it down into a really, really elegant, simple solution that is still as robust as it needs to be, right? We're in a really good place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I totally agree with you. I think, like you're saying, we need the PR campaign that made Brussels sprouts delicious, right? Like,
yes. We just need to roast them. Just roast
char them a little. Or we need a campaign in a way to bring to light the potential of UX. We're not just Brussels sprouts, right? We can bring so much to the table. And I think that also speaks a bit to your earlier point, which is there's what people ask for, and then there's what people need. Mm-hmm. And obviously there's going to be certain things you may still have to pay your bills, right? You may still have to say, all right, I understand that this is what you need. I'm going to design it for you. But I think offering alternatives, or more importantly, asking questions about something that can become an alternative, even if you're not making the alternative yourself. In fact, like I would even venture to say, like, just going completely rogue and making an alternative might backfire, because then someone might be like, that's not what I asked you to do. Like, where's that thing that I asked you to do, right? And especially when you're junior and don't have, maybe the clout that you would need, to make these sort of assertions. But I think you can ask questions that make other people say, wait, I don't know that either. Or that's a great question. Like, wait, can we figure this out? And then it becomes a joint effort to discover that meaning together. And I think that approach can help us eventually become the Brussels sprouts, right? Can help us eventually market ourselves a bit better. But by starting to orchestrate this sort of question asking and shared understanding of whatever the objects and attributes might be, I think that goes a really long way.
This is what OOUX is. That is the campaign. That is the campaign. And that's what we're trying to do, is to say, this is what is possible. And even if you're junior and you don't have that clout, there's a whole term in our community called quiet OOUXing, like just doing it for yourself to come up with those questions. And then it's like, not like you need to come in with your guns blazing and be like, let's do this, like, let's completely change our process. And that's not what Orca is all about. Orca just supports all the other processes that are going on, but it can feel, people can have that reaction of like, who are you to come and say that we need to go change how we're doing things? You can add this to your process, and it just makes everything else easier. It just supports everything else. And you can just do it on the side by yourself, quiet OOUXing, to come up with those really, really, like, I call them showstopper questions, like questions that slow the roll down so that we can move faster in the long run, right? That just makes people be like, look, like to have to kind of pick their jaw up off the floor. Like, those questions feel so good to ask, to be like, I've literally just stumped everybody. And they recognize that, like, that is, like, if you want to keep designing underneath that an assumption, that is very high risk. So
Yeah.
being that person is like, it feels so good and it provides a whole lot of value.
It really does. Well, Sophia, I can talk to you about this probably for a whole nother hour. But alas, it is that time. So I just wanted to ask, for people who are, hoping to learn a bit more about your work, where can you direct people to?
Yeah. So I've got a completely free training, OOUX.com/level up. So that would be the place to go to register for that training, or you can just back up, go to OOUX.com, and then you can explore all the things. There's a lot of free content out there, but that free training, I think, is a wonderful place to start. There's also the podcast. You can go to OOUX.com/podcast. And I'm making reels on Instagram as best as I possibly can and talking about this stuff. So you can go visit me over there at Sophia VUX too.
Amazing. Well, Sophia, thank you so, so much for your time. It has been so fun. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Cheers. Awesome. Thanks so much for having me.
That was Sophia Prater. If you want to learn more about her work, check out her site, rewiredux.com, where she offers workshops, courses, certification programs on object-oriented UX. She's also got an upcoming free 90-minute workshop called UX Level Up. So check that out at www.OOUX.com/UX Level Up. You can also find plenty of free resources on UX design, research, and strategy at our website, www.nngroup.com. And finally, if you like this show, consider subscribing or following us on the podcast platform of your choice so you never miss an update. This show is hosted and executive produced by me, Therese Fessenden, with all editing and production by Chrissy Richardson. That's it for today's show. Until next time, remember, keep it simple.